Hi there. Welcome back to the Art of China and Japan. In this lecture, we're going to look at the really important art of the Yuan Dynasty, which is a pivotal time in the history of China where everything gets upended and transformed. And the extraordinary long-lasting effect of this rather brief dynasty is what we're going to be talking about today. So to begin with, let's talk about the Song Dynasty, which was a fairly successful dynasty come together after the dissolution of the very significant Tang Dynasty, and the Song Dynasty, which we also call the Northern Song Dynasty for reasons will become clear, is a time when we see huge improvement in this technology that China would become famous for. In fact, when we speak the object China, we're referring to porcelain plates. And it's at this time in the Song Dynasty we find the porcelain comes into its own in this very sophisticated way. Now, porcelain is not just an organic clay body you can dig up out of the ground. It's a very complicated mixture of various minerals and materials, and it's fired at an extremely high temperature to create this bone white, very thin material that's extremely sturdy. Now, porcelain in its lustrous glow allows for this glazes that could then come into blues and greens. And this was really the ultimate prize of the porcelain, was to create ceramics that mimicked the luster of jade. Jade, of course, that very important stone that is believed to be a part of the sky, that is the abode of the gods. And so porcelain and this what's called celadon glaze becomes this very important way in which you could call in the idea of jade without actually working with this very difficult material, jade. And you can start to create other objects that were jade-like. So here we see a vessel. And what's curious about this vessel with its dragonfish on its sides is that it's not a traditional Chinese design, even though it's done in a traditional Chinese material and glaze. Its shape actually resembles an Islamic vessel from Syria in the 9th and 10th century. This just shows you that China in the Song Dynasty was a very worldly place. There was lots of trade happening to very far-flung places. The world was captivated by jade, and China was able to sell it exclusively because nobody could figure out how they made it. For another 500 years, it would take them to get anywhere close to this quality that they were producing so efficiently and effectively at this time. Also, in the Song Dynasty, we start to see traditional forms from the ancient past. Here we have the idea of the chong, remember from the earliest period, which was this squared cylinder that was open at both ends, that some liquid perhaps was poured through as a way of blessing. That's the assumed function that it had in the ancient past. At this time, the idea of the chong has been transformed. It's no longer a cylinder, but it's actually a vase. It's got a closed bottom, and its shape is elongated so that it can become a very functional vase for flowers. So it's bringing out the idea of the chong. It's calling attention to this idea, but it's also elaborating on it in such a way that is now useful for everyday use. And it's no longer a ritual object, but it evokes the ancient past. And we're going to see that a lot. This desire to invoke the ancient past is a recurring theme that will carry on throughout the remainder of our history of China. Now, China during the Song Dynasty is under continual attack from the northern borders. The nomadic tribes that exist up in what is now called Mongolia and the Russian steppe up there in Siberia. These nomads are continually coming down into China, raiding and pillaging and destroying cities in their wake. And eventually the capital of the Song Dynasty is captured, and they must retreat to the south in Hongqiao. They rebuild the southern Song dynasty. And so there is this wounded pride that this great empire has become subjected to the persistent and devastating attacks by the Mongol Empire. So in this time, we see this idea of a complete China, an idea that China was whole from its ancient times. This is something that they're trying to hold on to. We have this incredible object called the Yu Ji De, the map of the tracks of Yu, which is this incredible 3-foot square stone that is carefully etched with this map of China. And this map of China is of such extraordinary sophistication and accuracy that it really beggars to belief that they were able to compile all the information required to build such an amazing map at this early date. So you can see here, this is what this stone would be. This is a rubbing. So they would take a piece of paper and they would place it over this stone and then carefully rub up the image so that the incised areas would appear white. So it's a little difficult to read the actual rubbing from this scale. So here is a positive, and you can see all these characters and notes and detailed information about this territory that is inscribed in this stone. In fact, the stone describes nearly 380 different administrative districts, nearly 80 rivers, 70 mountains, and 5 lakes. So the incredible complexity of this map really speaks to this amazing scientific abilities of the Chinese Empire at this time, that they could compile all this and put it together in such a coherent way, which accurately measures out such vast distances. Now, the title of this work is very peculiar. It's not saying this is China today, but it's actually referring back to this mythical, legendary Emperor Yu, who was in the Xia Dynasty. So going way back before the Shang Dynasty, we have this legendary Xia Dynasty that is only written about in later contexts. And it's here that they're invoking this idea that there was at this ancient time this complete and whole China that was unified under this one great emperor. So this is a bit of a fiction. We know from our history that the unification of China into its territories as we roughly see them here, this would be something that would actually happen much later in the Qin dynasty. But in fact, the idea is that this notion of a whole and complete territorial China is something they're invoking as something much, much more ancient than that. And this is a way in which they are trying to rebuild in their imaginations this whole and complete world, which is otherwise lost to them. Now, unfortunately, the Song dynasty is eventually completely overrun by the Mongol Empire, and they establish this new dynasty called the Yuan Dynasty. Now, the Yuan Dynasty is a part of this massive Mongol territory, which is ruled over by the Khans, the Kublai Khan, and Genghis Khan. In this, you can see this incredible, vast swath of territory that they control. And it's a loose confederation of nomadic peoples that run this. It's a very different kind of government. It's a very different kind of society that is incredibly successful at war, but really had some trouble maintaining administrative and diplomatic relations with the outside world. So it's a complicated patchwork of alliances that sort of sort all this territory together. And they had their own cultural values. And they thought of China as this great prize that they were going to win to establish their legitimacy and their power. But they really wanted to shape the Chinese empire to their own values and cultural norms. So during the Yuan Dynasty, there was this Mongol social order which was superimposed on top of what had been in the Song Dynasty, this Confucian social order. So it used to be Scholars were these very highly valued people in society. Then were the farmers. They were the people who are producers, creating new things. Laborers are also making new things. But merchants were thought of as lesser in the society because they didn't actually make things. They just sort of moved things around. And performers, of course, were the absolute lowest of the low because they didn't actually make anything. They were just there entertaining people, taking their money, and giving them nothing of any material value for their time. So in the Mongol social order, they really valued merchants, and they also really enjoyed their performers. So we saw this, flipping of the social order. Scholars, they still need to keep their government running, and they tolerated them, but they weren't terribly interested in what they had to offer. Laborers, of course, were just common chattel, and farmers, these people who settled the land, they had absolutely no respect or value for because they were nomads and they didn't settle and till the land. They traveled and moved throughout the world. So during this huge upheaval, the scholars, which had been at the very center of the society for so long, deeply resented and felt the brunt of this change very powerfully. Here, a scholar by the name of Gong Kai paints this very famous work, The Emaciated Horse, which is simply ink on paper. You notice how many signatures there are on this painting. This is passed through many hands and recognized as a seminal painting that powerfully illustrates the subjection of the Chinese Han population and the Mongol rule. In this painting, Gong Kai writes, "Who today laments over the bones of this noble steed? In the setting sun, along the sandy shore, he casts a shadow like a mountain." So the horse is likened to a landscape, right? It's given this like a mountain. So the horse embodies this idea of a place that is China, that is now emaciated and destroyed by Mongol rule. This is a very explicit reference to the crushing of the cultural norms and the society of the whole by the brutal Mongol rule. And so the horse, this emaciated horse, becomes a symbol of China. We saw that in earlier bronze and ceramic representations of the horse, that the horse becomes this symbol of China. Now, ironically, actually, the horse comes from Central Asia, the very place the Mongol rules. But in this case, this refiguring of it, the horse is no longer a Mongol property, but it is something that becomes the identity of China itself. Here's another really wonderful painting of orchids, and we see this beautiful and elegant and simple movement of the brushstrokes to describe this lovely plant. When Zheng Xixiao painted this, he was asked why he didn't paint any ground or background to his painting, and he simply replied, "The Mongols had taken it all." Now, a very famous scholar comes out at this time, Xiao Mengfu, and he decides it is in his interest to work with the Mongol government, and he becomes a very celebrated calligrapher and painter. And what he does at this time is really important to Chinese calligraphy and painting going forward, in that he unifies calligraphy and painting in a way that no one had done before. Now, there's a very spare, minimal quality to his work. He's drawing on this simple, elegant, loose way of representing things where he has a foreground and a background, and he allows for this empty space in the middle ground to create this wonderful ambiguous way in which these two areas relate to each other. If we look closely at his painting, we'll notice that the brushstrokes are much more clearly a brushstroke. And he's very intentionally using the kinds of brushstrokes that you would see in calligraphy in his painting. So he's making us very aware of the brushstrokes as brushstrokes. It's not illusionary in the sense that it's trying to represent an actual landscape with that like lifeness that we saw in the Song Dynasty, where the ability to mimic nature was the greatest prize of their painting. Instead, here he's moving away from representing rocks and pines as they appear, and instead he's transforming them more into calligraphy. Now, in his calligraphy, he had a way of bringing a confidence and an elegance to his work that really represented this notion of the Tang Dynasty, which was this time before the Song. The Song was weak and failed to keep the Mongols out, but this earlier dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, becomes the dynasty that becomes the cultural touchstone. And so he is looking at Wang Xi's, the very important preface to the Orchid Pavilion. He's looking at that and he's drawing from the strength and elegance of that calligraphy at this time and reinstilling that in his own. So here is a fascinating painting where you can see again the brushstrokes are very clearly brushstrokes, and there's this wonderful energetic swiftness to the way he's building up his forms, just like you would in an expressive form of calligraphy. He's also in this way bringing in several different kinds of brushstrokes. So the various elements of his painting, the rocks, the trees, the grasses, each of these is treated with a slightly different kind of brushstroke. And in his commentary on this painting, he even says as much. The rocks are like flying white. The trees are like seal script. The writing of bamboo draws upon the Baffin method. Only when one masters this secret will he understand that calligraphy and painting have always been one. So he's setting forward a really interesting idea that, they've always used this brush in both painting and calligraphy, and that this ultimate unity of the image is what he's striving for. Even though he's compiling all these different kinds of brushstrokes from different kinds of calligraphy, he's unifying them with this idea that the brush, and it is a painting, it is ultimately a picture. It is not a representation. It is calligraphy. It is the way we see calligraphy. The calligraphy is a symbolic way of representing the world, and so is painting a symbolic way of representing the world. I'm going to move away from the illusion that this is a real rock and a real tree and bamboo, and I'm going to bring you into this world of illusion, which is the image that the calligraphy creates. Now, as I said, Xia Mengfu was a scholar official who agreed to work with the Mongol government. And in that capacity, he was trying to mollify the harsh policies and oppressive ways of the Mongol Empire against the Han Chinese. But we have this really curious painting by Xia Mengfu, a painting of a sheep and a goat. And it's a curious painting, and it's a very famous one because it's such a peculiar topic for a painter of his stature to pick up. It's sort of a slice of life, simple barnyard animals, and it's rendered in a kind of classical way. He gives them wonderful, clear, vibrant brushstrokes. And in his text, which you see here between the two animals, that he simply states, I have painted horses, but I have not tried sheep or goats. Since Shang Xin asked me for a painting, I have playfully painted these from life. Although the painting cannot approach those of the ancient masters, it seems to have somewhat captured their spirit countenance. So in this case here, he's kind of moving away from his work with landscape, where he's trying to unify the brushstrokes, and instead he's just painting from life. Actually, a kind of an odd thing to say. And also that he mentions that he's done horses, but he hasn't done this. So this is something new. And people have often interpreted this oblique reference to horses and the ways in which he's going about this painting, that what he's talking about here is not just about painting sheep and goats because he felt like it, but he's actually very subtly referring to an ancient tale. And during the time when the Qin Empire took over China and brutally oppressed people, there was this famous general who refused to collaborate with the Qin dynasty and instead went up into the mountains and raised sheep and goats. And so people have often thought of this painting as a way in which he is expressing his regret for having agreed to work with the Mongol government. And instead, he wishes that he had, like that ancient general, gone and raised sheep and goats up in the mountains. Again, this is all speculation. He doesn't say this explicitly, and it's possible that this is just what scholars and readers and who wanted to give to this meaning to this text. We don't know for sure, but it's a compelling idea. Now, as I said, Xiao Mengfu is interested in bringing back the vitality of the Tang calligraphy. And his project is to bring it back with this conviction that it will restore the unity and the cultural integrity of China. The calligraphy is considered such an important part of Chinese society that by focusing on maintaining that precision and that care, that somehow it will maintain the unity of the Chinese cultural past. In this work, you also see he's integrated with his calligraphy on the left, this section in the very beginning of the scroll, which is done in the more ancient seal script. And the fact that he's using that with this as the title for his inscription, he's drawing in this idea that the inscriptions are creating a continuity of calligraphy. All of that was happening in the elite sphere, the scholars who were experiencing these changes and commenting on these changes in their work. One of the things that a lot of scholars began to do was, as many of the offices for scholars had been closed off and many of them just flatly refused to work with the Mongols, to find some kind of employment during the Yuan Dynasty, they turned their attention to popular culture. And a lot of these works that were created during the Yuan Dynasty were done anonymously because, well, it's kind of dodgy creating popular works, things like detective stories and things like adventure tales, and having them published in this illustrated manner, which was called Shangtu Xiaowen. Illustrated books were popular fiction and fairy tales would be told, and people would just buy these things on the street markets. Now, I said detective stories, and it's true, even though detective stories didn't really appear in great number until the 19th century in Europe. In the Yuan Dynasty, they become a very popular form of fiction. This idea of justice, you have this Confucian magistrate who goes after criminals, and he asserts the rule of law. These were enormously popular tales at this time that were illustrated with this 1/3 of the top of the page would have a drawing, and then the bottom 2/3 would have the story. And this was a way in which people and stories began to get disseminated at this time. Was in this. And it was also really important because this popular form of illustration started to bring out new kinds of visual narrative practices that would become important later in the development of more longer and complicated picture stories. Also, at this time, we have the emergence of fully scripted plays, which were known as Yuan Zaju. Now, prior to this time, we're talking about the 14th century, prior to this time, plays were largely improvised. Actors would go on stage and they would do pantomimes and they would do juggling acts and they would improvise, but they didn't actually play out a whole story from a script because they were so persecuted in the past, they never had the resources to develop and the stability to develop. But now under the Mongols, they're given license to create fully scripted productions that were quite popular. In fact, they were amazingly popular at this time. Yuan Zaju emerges. We have these scripts that were written, these fantastic stories And we have images of the performers we see here in this mural from Shanxi province. And we have other artifacts that also begin to tell of the importance of theater at this time. We also see this wonderful porcelain headrest. So this would have been like a pillow, so people would prop their head up while they slept. And yet it's created to look like a little theater, where we see the Taoist immortals attending to the play in the theater. So like you're sleeping on this pillow and the Taoist immortals are there watching you dream, I think, which is the actual theater of your head. Xiao Mengfu agreed to work with the Mongol government, but Nizan decided against it. He was a wealthy landowner who was well established in the scholarly circles, but then he decides, I'm done with this. And he just gave everything away. He moves into a small houseboat and he lives off handouts, so whatever his friends and people willing to provide for him. And he paints in his leisure hours. And so here we see in this artist in exile, Nizan is painting what he calls six gentlemen. The six gentlemen are the trees in the foreground. And this is part of what we saw in the Song Dynasty, was the way in which trees become emblematic of virtues. And so the tree, which stands immobile and serene in the landscape, is an exemplary example of what it means to be a human. Nizan begins writing on his paintings. In this way, he starts to create a commentary, a personal anecdotes. And this is what makes his painting so fascinating, is not only is his dry, simple, elegant, and scratchy images, they're filled with these personal, funny anecdotes that he has commenting on his painting. And he says in this one here, Six Gentlemen, Old Master Dachu would have a good laugh when he sees this. It's like, I know this is really bad painting. It's like this self-deprecating. He's just like, it doesn't even matter that it looks like any kind of painting anyone's done before. I'm just doing this because it's fun. And he even says so much in this painting, the Rongxi Studio. What I call painting does not exceed the joy of careless sketching with the brush. I do not seek formal likeness, but do it simply for my own amusement. And he's saying that because, people say, you call what I do bad painting, but I never said I was painting. I'm just moving my brush across this piece of paper. He isn't trying to make any kind of argument, like Xiao Mengfu would say, oh, well, it's nothing like, the great masters of the past, but at least it shows some integrity that's quite better than anything anyone else is doing right now. But in Nizan, he's just not even making any attempt at comparison. He's just saying, to hell with it. I'm just painting because I feel like painting. His argument against those critics who would say his work is not painting, he would say, hey, how could you scold a eunuch for not growing a beard? Like, how could you blame me for making a painting when I never said that was my intent at all? Here, Nizan invokes this idea of his isolation and his peaceful repose out in the wilderness. He writes, in a forest pavilion, bamboo and trees give thickly overlapping shade. Seeking friends, crying ying, I too am fond of music. And this is what he sees in the Rongxi Studio, this painting, where you see this very simple architecture, this feeling of desire and longing for this quiet, contemplative distance from everything that's going on and all the tumult and activity in the outside world. And he writes further, reciting to strings, gathered scholars are from time to time arranged and seated. In his district, Master Fu had only to play the chin. Okay? He's saying, back in that city, far away from where I am, they're telling these scholars what to do all the time. Who would want that? Who would want to be a scholar? You have no freedom, you have no independence, while I, here in my Rongxi studio, can do entirely as I please. And he commenting that this is really antithetical to the fundamental notions of Confucianism, which was very, in a sense, kind of libertarian in the way in which everyone should know what to do properly. We shouldn't be told or forced to do things. All Master Fu, this great Confucian master of the past, had to do was play the qin, which is this stringed instrument. And in that, he was able to remind people of their better selves. The music that he played was all it took to tell people to come and do their work and be virtuous. And so this is a way in which Nizan becomes this fairly important cultural critic. He's outside of society. He's completely cut off all his ties. And even after the fall of the Yuan Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty emerges, he says, no, I'm kind of happy where I am. I don't feel like there's really any benefit to being a part of that crazy system you have going on there. And so he really becomes this scholar who speaks out against the vast architecture of scholar officialdom that just is this massive juggernaut that runs over everything in Chinese civilization from here on into the future. So as I said, the Yuan Dynasty does come to a fall after a series of dramatically devastating military failures. Failed to invasion of Japan in 1274, where the samurai were able to beat the Mongols back from their shores, and 1293, a failed invasion of Java. Now, one of the ways in which the Yuan Dynasty funded all of its military exploits was that they printed money. And we know China had paper money for several centuries now. And what the Yuan Dynasty did was just to keep printing it, forcing people to use their money. And this only further increased people's frustration with this regime because the money becomes worthless. They printed so much it wasn't backed by anything. It wasn't really representing any actual value for anything. And because of that, people really resented having to use it, this treasure voucher, as it was called. And so eventually the Yuan Dynasty collapses in 1368. Then we have the emergence of the Ming Dynasty. So, to review what we talked about here, question 1, who were the big winners and losers of the Mongol social order in the Yuan Dynasty? So as we said, we talked about the way in which the scholars and the farmers and the laborers went down and how merchants were highly prized and the performers also got a big boost in the Yuan Dynasty. Question 2, how did scholars react to the changes in the Yuan Dynasty? Well, of course, this heavily oppressive government comes in and overthrows the social order. This was deeply upsetting and disastrous to the scholars on many levels. And so we saw in the critic of the emaciated horse an explicit rejection of the Yuan Dynasty. But then we saw more subtle commentary by Xiao Fu and his sheep and goat. So Xiao Fu, question 3, what ideas did he bring to painting? Xiao Fu did a very important thing in that he really looked to calligraphy to unify painting. And this is an idea that has very powerful resonance that draws out of the traditions of painting and really distills it down to this very powerful essence. How did the popular arts develop? Well, we saw with this massive change in the social order in the Yuan Dynasty, a lot of scholars were out of work, and so they turned to popular arts and began writing plays and began writing popular fiction as a way to make some money and to pay for things. And even after the fall of the Yuan Dynasty, these forms, theater and popular literature, continue on. Nizan. What was Nizan's view of painting and court officials? Nizan was a recluse. He cut himself off from the world and went off to live on a houseboat and painted whatever he damn well pleased. And with that autonomy, he really establishes himself as a cultural critic, a person who's willing to stand outside of society and point out its failings and its weaknesses.